been discussing sexual violence from a very basic overview approach. We talked about various forms of sexual violence and what that might look like. But in this video, we're going to start digging deeper into the nuances of sexual violence. Before we do that, though, it's essential to understand the extent to the problem. So, how many people are actually affected by sexual violence? Well, 1 out of every 6 American women have been the victim of rape or attempted rape in her lifetime. So that's rape, not sexual assault. That number is even more shocking when you look broaden the category to include various forms of sexual violence. Nearly 3% of American men, or rather 1 in 33, have experienced attempted or completed rape. While that is significantly higher than experienced by women, that's also probably more than most people would have expected in the first place. Importantly, though, only 25% of those reports of rape that were reported to the police actually resulted in the arrest of the perpetrator. So who are the victims of sexual assault? Since we now know that it happens much more than we thought, right? Well, on average, there are 433,000 plus victims over the age of 12 of rape or sexual assault every year in the United States. This information on this side you're going to see were all pulled from the RAINN website. There's many useful articles there, and I highly recommend you explore their website a good bit. So the people that are the most at risk are actually those that are younger, from ages about 12 to about 34 is when we see the bulk of sexual victimization occur. Those that are over the age of 65 are significantly less likely to be a victim, but yet it still does occur. And we see a lot of disparity actually in terms of race. Now, all that is, this first column is the total, and then here you see the various forms. Now, it's important to note that these are all estimates are based on those cases of sexual violence that were reported to the police. And there are certainly mechanisms in place that make it easier or more difficult for certain groups of people to report. So while these are useful for us to begin to understand what sexual violence may look like in society, or in American society anyway, we should be mindful that it is very possible that the true form looks much different. And if we were able to access the cases of those that are not reported, this distribution by race may look considerably more different. So who are the offenders? Well, most sexual violence occurs within the context of a dating relationship. So it's usually a boyfriend-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend-girlfriend. In fact, sexual violence between strangers is very uncommon. It does occur. That's not to say it doesn't happen. It certainly does, but it's more frequently someone that you know. And most offenders actually do share certain characteristics. So some of these common characteristics include, if you look at their life and their relationships with people of the opposite sex, they tend to not maintain the best of friendships with them. Maybe they argue a lot, or it's tumultuous, or they just don't have any friends of the opposite sex. They tend to have a relative lack of empathy. And that makes sense, because in order to commit such sexual violence, you have to know that you are going to be causing a person some serious psychological, physical, and emotional harm. So if you have empathy, that's going to be very difficult for you, because you'll feel their harm and their pain as though it's happening to you. It's also very common to see among people that are convicted of rape that they have poor anger and impulse control. So they don't have many coping mechanisms to handle when they feel extreme emotion. They also sometimes will have cognitive distortions, but what that means is their thoughts are just inaccurate when compared with reality. So they might have inappropriate expectations or unrealistic expectations for what women should be. So if that's the case, then they may be more likely to commit rape because they feel entitled to women, or whatever the case might be. They also might think that they have a connection with women when they don't. Or male, I should say, because this can involve female rapists as well. So it's also common to see among people that are convicted of rape that they live very impulsive life. They will go live life on a whim, go from place to place, quit jobs, start a new job, end off relationships. They might get in fights at the bar. They go out a lot. They might have some destructive habits, so they might use drugs and alcohol. They may, gamble or other sorts of antisocial behaviors. And finally, there may be some sexual elements of sexual fantasy there, where they may fantasize about images and videos of rape, essentially, of sex that involves force or coercion. Now, granted, it's a very complex issue we're not going to get into here, but when you look at pornography, there is a whole body of pornography now that involves violence. And if people are watching that and find that arousing, then that may make them feel compelled to practice that in their real life. Now, I would like to note that this last one here tends to be the least common. Okay, we tend to think that, well, if they're a rapist, they must have some sort of sexual delusion or depravity, but that's not always the case. It's really important that you recognize and understand that rape and sex are not the same thing. They're not the same thing for the perpetrator, and they're certainly not the same thing for the victim. For rape is experienced as an act of violence. It is violence. Rape is, all of its features, its consequences are much more consistent with violence than sex, right? Sex is an intimate moment. It can be passionate, it can be loving and warm. And rape is very much the opposite of this. Okay, so while sexual attraction sometimes might be involved in deciding who they're going to target, it's usually has very little to do with the decision to actually commit the rape. So what that means is that sex and sexual desire are not responsible for the rates of sexual violence that we see. Okay, in fact, it's interestingly, most rapists already have access to a consenting sexual partner, meaning they're already in a relationship where they have somebody that they can be intimate with like that. Instead, the primary motives, and what it all really comes down to, are power and control. Anger is certainly involved as well, but power and control are really at the heart of it. And it's not always necessarily about getting power over another person, or at least not consciously, but they may feel the need to get some sort of control and power back in their own life, exercise power, feel strong and assertive again, and so they use rape as a means to achieve that. So, in other words, this is a theory of interpersonal aggression, is how we understand rape. We're not studying rape right there in the same way we would study sex, because it's not. It's violence. So we approach it like it's violence. So what that means is that the same mechanisms that cause aggression to occur in interpersonal violence, assault, aggravated assault, murder, are the same forces that are involved in rape. Okay, it's not about material gain, it's not about fitting in, it's about power and control and violence. So there's other various approaches to explaining sexual violence, and we just brushed on power and control. Sexual motivation I put on this list because I wanted you to have in your mind that many people assume that the rapist just really wants sex, and so they're just going to go out and get it any way they can. And that's a very shallow, inaccurate interpretation of sexual violence. Okay, again, it has very little to do with sexual desire. They're not going out because they just need sex so bad and committing rape. They're committing rape because they have many factors involved that we're going to go into here, but it's they are trying to regain power and control back in their life. Okay, and then we're going to go over these other remaining ones here now. So socialization, we've talked about all semester long when we've talked about the socialization of gender. Well, the same holds for violence. If you recall, we spoke about when we watched Tough Guys at the beginning of the semester, how violence gets socialized into males' lives in a way that it does not in women's lives. And this is often cited as one of the strongest explanations for why men commit so much more sexual violence than women do. Right? But youth, in particular male youths, are taught to be aggressive and forceful. Right? You're supposed to try to be the best and do what you can, take what you want to get to the top. Well, youths that are taught that are more likely then to engage in those sorts of behaviors throughout the rest of their life. Okay, they this can spill over into the sexual arena then. So it's not just about winning and being the best and being on top. It's about doing that in the form of sexual conquests. And if a person says no, then they could be getting in their way of trying to be the best, and they've been socialized to win. So they keep going, and they take it, they demand it. Okay, this socialization can create aggressors, right? And that's at the heart of this socialization of violence, right? And it encourages, when we have a socially normalized sense about sexual violence, it tells perpetrators that it's okay, right? We may be passively doing so, but the outcome is the same. So machismo is a similar concept, right? But it's rooted in this man's man, right? If you can picture I'm the most interesting man in the world, Dos Equis commercial, right? Where there's this man and he is just the definition of what a good man should be. He's clean cut, good looking, wealthy. He's got alcohol and women and money, right? And that is, in essence, this idea of what a good man should be. But machismo takes it further and says that men bond over this. So they're looking for ways to prove themselves to other men, right? That is consistent with what we've been learning all semester, right? That we try to prove our identity to other people and prove that we're worthy and that we should be respected and taken seriously. And so for men, the way to do that is through sexual violence, right? So this explains kind of the normalization of locker room jokes, or treating women in the workplace a certain way, or other forms of men bonding together over what could be perceived as their superiority over women. And so sexual violence then becomes just another tool for them to maintain this image to other men that they are worthy. And so this comic here, I think sums it up excellently, right? All of these guys here are bothering this girl that's by herself, but they're bonding over it, right? And you see they're all having fun together, and they're kind of building this environment in which it's sending messages to each other that go ahead, right? We're not going to stop you. In fact, we're gonna laugh about it. So there's also some biological explanations of rape and sexual assault. In particular, these tend to take an evolutionary approach. So having in mind, right, life is about procreation, right? So we are all fighting to procreate and have more children and continue our species. And if you look in the animal kingdom, you'll see all the time, if you ever watch, Animal Planet or the like, where two wildebeest or whatever will begin fighting, two male wildebeest will be fighting to try to gain the right or the dominance, right, to be able to then, go engage in sex with the female wildebeest. Okay, and so this is the idea that's at the heart of evolutionary theory, is that basically all men are striving to procreate, and so they're all competing against each other to do so, right? And so their rape is a result of this drive to perpetuate the human species, right? So it's this genetic holdover, they call it, which really just means that I want to keep my genes alive. I want my genes and my last name and everything to stay alive, so I'm going to try to have sex with as many women as possible so that I can have as many children as possible and keep my name going. Now, obviously, critics are quite harsh on evolutionary theory, especially because most men would tell you that they are not trying to impregnate as many women as possible. But there is an interesting idea here, right? The evolutionary and survival of the fittest and competition, it's worth thinking about and considering how this might apply. So the culture of violence theory is exactly as it sounds, right? And this kind of goes hand in hand with machismo, right? Where men are bonding and kind of creating this normalization of sexual violence. So the culture of violence theory says more broadly that our society as a whole has created a culture that is tolerant, if not accepting, if not encouraging, of sexual violence. This is often, you'll hear it referred to as rape culture. And that is what we're talking about here, where the objectification of women and the glamorization of sexual violence lead to a culture where rape is not, it's not that people are like, oh yeah, go out and rape, but nobody is actively sending message that it's not acceptable. Okay, and to say nobody is sending that message is unfair. I'm sorry. Really what I should say is that the society as a whole, our culture collectively, says we will tolerate it. We don't mind. You know, you can keep on and no one's going to intervene. So this is, and it almost goes so far as to say, to then understand that violence and aggression to try to achieve sex is understandable. Right? Yeah, well, you got to get it. Do what you can to get it, right? That it's that mindset. And that's a dangerous mindset, to be sure. So perpetrators often view their victims as targets. They see them as, this is what that's mine, I want it, I'm going to get it. And they think that certain people actually do want that. They will see that, well, in this culture, right, they act like they don't want it, but they do want it. You know, the song Blurred Lines got a really hard time, has gotten a lot of criticism because the blurred line that the song is speaking of is this blurred line of consent, right? But if you go back and really listen to that song, it really does capture this idea of this culture of violence here, right? Of certain people believing that others want to be dominated, right? You want it. Tell them she's a good girl, right? This attitude is very illustrative of what the culture of violence theory is getting at, and that is, in a nutshell, the most important explanations and most generally accepted and recognized explanations of sexual violence.